Welcome back. Moving on to chapter 13 this week. So as mentioned in the chapter 12 discussion, these two chapters, chapters 12 and 13, go together. Chapter 12 was essentially a rationale for testing, as in why would one do it if you're a strength and conditioning coach. And then chapter 13 is more of a how-to chapter. So if you happen to have looked at it, it's a fairly long chapter, but the vast majority of it is instructions on how to perform a variety of tests, ranging from different agility drills like the 5-10-5 to the T-test to how to perform a 1 repetition max back squat to the 12-minute run and a variety of other tests. So the good news is, because so much of this chapter is instructional how-to kind of stuff, the actual lecture version of this is going to be fairly short. So I'm going to try to keep this thing under 20 minutes because you've had to sit through plenty of lectures of mine that are over an hour. So I'm going to try to keep this one fairly short. So what I'm going to do is cover kind of the first part of the chapter, and then I'm going to buzz through all the tests on the screen cap on this thing that you're seeing, and then we'll cover or talk briefly about some of the things on the last few slides. But obviously the full slideshow is up in Canvas, and so that way you can access it whenever you're taking your quiz, but also whenever you're working on your program design project, so that you can see how to perform a variety of tests. And obviously if you have the book, you don't really need that extensive slideshow. If it were me, I would use the textbook. Just easier to flip through it than it is through the slideshow. But if you happen to not have the book, the slideshow is there for you as well. So there are a bunch of different types of tests one might do, and obviously that depends upon the nature of the sport. So if you work with football versus working with cross country, the types of tests you would have your athletes perform can be very different. Because the parameters of performance are different, right? So with your cross-country athletes, obviously that's largely dependent on things like their aerobic capacity, their lactate threshold, their running economy, all those kinds of things, versus in the case of a football player, it is muscular strength, muscular power, repeated sprint ability, those kinds of things. And so because of those differences between those sports, then that's going to affect what we test. I don't really care about the aerobic capacity of my offensive line in the same way that I don't really care necessarily about the vertical jump ability of my cross-country runners. I might be kind of interested in that. It's a pretty easy test to do, but I probably wouldn't bother to test it. All right, so in terms of different types of tests, so you can see the first one here, so muscular strength. So think of these as 1 repetition max tests. There are other ways to test this, but by far the most popular is 1 repetition maxes. So things like a maximal squat, bench press, deadlift, etc. So one of the things in the textbook version of this is the time that each of these tests take to perform. So for example, if you're doing a maximal deadlift, let's say, that'll take somewhere between 2 and 4 seconds to perform the lift, maybe even a couple more seconds than that if they're really grinding it out. So just to give you an idea of both duration, and then the duration obviously is related to the energy systems used. So obviously maximum muscular strength from an energetics standpoint, we're looking at the ATP phosphocreatine system because again, it's less than 10 seconds in duration. And as mentioned, the chapter shows a bunch of different types of tests of muscular strength, including squats. There's also a row type of a test and several others as well. If we're going to test muscular power, so they get into some additional names on there, also known as high speed strength, also called maximal anaerobic muscular power or anaerobic power. It's explosive movement, right? So that's what all of these things are. So by far the most common anaerobic power test is the vertical jump. It is how much force can you generate in a very short period of time and propel yourself into the air. So vertical jump's the most popular. There's another one that the book mentions, which is sprinting up a staircase. These tests are typically 1 second in duration, maybe a little bit longer, but not much. So they're pretty quick because, again, they're explosive. Sometimes the Olympic lifts will be used to test these. So obviously then those would be a few seconds longer, but still less than 10 seconds. So that would be another way to assess muscular power, would be to do some of the more explosive lifts. Their anaerobic capacity, so now we're testing the glycolytic system. So remember, the glycolytic system we use for certainly less than 2 minutes, probably less than 90 seconds. So this is as hard as they can go for somewhere between 30 and 90 seconds. So maybe you have them run a 400 meter or run, so 1 lap around the track or a lap and a half, something like that, to test their glycolytic capacity. To test muscular endurance, So these are usually repetitions to failure. So these are pretty common with like military or other first responder types or first responder types of tests. So you see these like push-ups for reps, pull-ups for reps, and typically there's a 1 or 2 minute time limit, something like that. And so obviously that may last 2 minutes or a little bit less. Or another thing to do for muscular endurance is to have them do, rather than repeated contractions like you see in push-ups, to have them do sustained contractions. So they would do something like planks where they're holding, you know, a prone plank or a side plank, whatever it is, for as long as they can while maintaining good form. And so that may last only a few seconds, or that may last a few minutes depending upon their ability. To test their aerobic capacity, as we discussed last time, that requires, like, to do a true aerobic capacity test, that's a lab test. And so one of the things we talked about in chapter 12 was the distinction between lab tests and field tests. And so typically an aerobic capacity test is a lab test because it requires a metabolic cart, it requires, you know, a mask and being able to measure airflow and all those kinds of things. And so in a strength and conditioning context, unless you're a really big budget or professional program, you're probably going to do field tests and use those to estimate the aerobic capacity. So you may have the athletes do a 12-minute run, yo-yo test, beep test. They're pretty similar. And there's stair stepping. There's a number of other ways to test that that are less equipment intensive than the lab version of the test. But for any of those things, you're going to use those to test their ability to deliver and use oxygen at the working muscles. So we use this for more of our endurance type of athletes, but you might also test this stuff for some of your interval sprint athletes. So for athletes like wheelchair basketball, like lacrosse, like hockey, soccer, those kinds of athletes are going to do repeated sprints with short breaks between. And so you might want to test or you might be interested in testing their aerobic capacity because that is going to affect their recovery time between those sprints. Agility, so that is change of direction ability, and there are a variety of tests depending upon which sport we're talking about. So in football, things like the Pro Agility and the T-test are pretty common. Soccer has some different tests. Sometimes they involve, you know, dribbling the ball, those kinds of things. But all of your agility tests are change of direction kind of a test. So for example, with the T-test, you know, they basically, I forget the distances because I haven't looked through all the diagrams in this chapter myself at the moment. But I've run T-tests before, and my recollection of them is that you sprint 5 yards forward, and then you go 5 yards to the left, 10 yards to the right, and then 5 yards back to the middle, and then back to the original cone. So it is this combination of these little 5-yard segments that you string together to perform the test. So it involves, you know, running forward, being able to cut right and left, and then being able to turn around the cones in a really tight fashion. So in doing that, then you're testing their ability to absorb their weight as they go to change directions and then accelerate into the change. So again, testing their ability to change directions with agility stuff. Speed, depends on what sport you're interested in. These can vary. You know, obviously if you're doing something like ice hockey, there are probably some pretty specific tests to assess speed in that. But more common ones are like 10 and 40-yard sprints. The really short ones, like a 10-yard sprint, test acceleration versus the 40-yard dash tests top-end speed. But those, you know, if you're a soccer coach, those may not be useful tests for you, or if you are a basketball coach, those might not be useful tests for you. So you may have slightly different distances. But those are two of the more common ones, are the 10-yard dash and the 40-yard dash. Flexibility, range of motion. Flexibility you've probably tested in other classes. So the classic flexibility test is the sit and reach, where you sit down on your butt and then you reach forward with both hands, one on top or stacked one on top of the other, and you try to reach as far as you can on a yardstick. That's one of the more common flexibility tests, but obviously there are others. Balance and stability, pretty similar. So balance, as you can see there, is the ability to maintain their equilibrium. Stability is basically the ability to return to a balanced position, to return to equilibrium. So stability typically involves that there has been a perturbation, there's been a change of position, and that they're able to then correct that. So common tests here, one of the more common ones is the balance error scoring system, which you'll see at the very end of the slideshow, that involves this combination of 2 leg stance, 1 leg stance, 1 foot in front of the other stance, and then the AirX pad, which is the blue squishy pad. And then it also involves a combination of eyes open and eyes closed. And then if you wanted to assess stability, what you could do is to introduce some perturbations there. So you usually do this more with like a Bosu ball, the little half ball things, and you can kind of poke at it sort of, and have them adjust to those perturbations or those changes of position. Body composition looks at what proportion of them is fat mass versus what proportion of them is lean mass. So body composition testing includes things like skin fold calipers, which there are diagrams later in the slideshow where you basically pinch someone's subcutaneous fat and measure how thick the folds are. It's a pretty unromantic description of it, but that is what you do. There's also DEXA, as we talked about in Chapter 12. Bioelectrical impedance is pretty common. Those are kind of the big ways that people do body composition assessment. I think I hit the big ones. There's BOD-POD too. That's another one. You might see the BOD-POD if you're at a big time program. Anthropometry is girth measurements. So maybe you measure their upper arms, their calves, their thighs, their waist, those kinds of things. And so typically these two run together. So, pre-program, you would do some anthropometry testing. Let's say you've got a big football player that wants to add some size. So we'll have him, set a goal to add 1/2 inch to his upper arm or 1 inch to his upper arm, something like that, right? And so that's anthropometry. But ideally also he would have improved his body composition. So maybe he drops his body fat percentage from, I don't know, let's say 15% to 14%, something like that. So these two are typically assessed together. You usually do anthropometric measurements first and then body composition, and you kind of get this overall picture of where they are as far as their physical dimensions and then their fat mass. As far as testing conditions goes, so this is pretty similar to what we talked about with Chapter 12. So we want to maximize the reliability of the test, which is the repeatability of them. And so to do that, we want to make sure that the conditions are the same for all athletes and that the conditions are the same for each athlete. So for example, if we test at 4 o'clock in August and it's hot, we probably want to test again at 4 o'clock in, let's say, May at the end of the school year when it's hot again. Now, ideally, you would avoid the heat, so maybe you test in the morning when it's more like 80 degrees, but you would do the same thing in May. So you try to make the conditions match as well as you can. You don't want to test, mid-afternoon one time, morning next time. Athletes perform differently at different times of day, so you don't want to do that. But just, like I said, try to be as consistent as possible with all the testing conditions. Same thing as far as, the surface. So you don't want to run the 40-yard dash one time on the track and the next time on the grass. You can't really compare those results very effectively. You don't want to run when it's 100 degrees one time and 60 degrees the next. Again, especially with an endurance event, the temperature is going to affect that. Don't test athletes when they're fatigued, at least if you want good results. So you would have them just do a quick warm-up and then have them go straight into the testing. So you wouldn't do testing like post-workout or something like that. Standardize the warm-ups. So we do, again, to maximize that reliability, what we did in the pre-test, we do in the post-test. So that includes the warm-up and that includes the cool-down. Cool-down less important because it's after the test, but just for the sake of standardization, you'd want to do that. All right, so here we're getting into all the detailed tests that you can do, and you'll see each one has a description as well as a reference to the figure and then the pictures of how to do them. So I won't bore you by going through all of these. I'm going to buzz right to the end, which will take a second. You can see there's a lot of these tests. All right, oh, nope, still going. That was the one, here's the one with the AirX pad that I mentioned. So there's the 3 different testing positions there. In this case, she's doing them with her eyes closed, which is the more advanced version of the test. Moving on. So I mentioned ability last time with Chapter 12. If you're having them do the overhead squat, make sure it's appropriate for your athletes. Don't take your 7th graders and have them do this because the vast majority of them don't have the balance and don't have the flexibility. Anyway, that aside, moving on. All right, statistics. So this isn't a real statistics discussion because you've had that in other classes and it was, I'm sure, covered more ably than I will do. But as we discussed last time, with your record keeping or with your testing, you're going to have to report out, right? So the reasons you're doing your testing are to report to the athletes and to report to the coaches, hopefully to get buy-in from both, and partially to keep you employed. And so, because you show the coach that your program works. So one of the decisions you're going to have to make then is how to analyze the results and how to present the results. And that's where the statistics come in. So there are a variety of different ways to present those numbers. One of the really common ways is to look at different measures of central tendency, which is obviously the midpoint. So most common is the mean, which is the average of the scores. You're familiar with that concept. But one of the problems with using the mean or the average is that if you have a really high number or a really low number, that can dramatically alter the average. So for example, if I have a class that I'm teaching where 1 or 2 students get zeros on an assignment, I don't use mean as the number that I report out because the class average is going to be much lower than it actually is for the students who completed the assignment, right? And so then if you have, again, really high, really low numbers, mean isn't the best. Typically in that case, then you use the median, which as you can see there is the middle score. So, and as it says there, that's typically used whenever you've got these really high or really low scores that throw off the average. So you're just finding the midpoint of the scores. As opposed to mode, which is the number that happens with the greatest frequency, almost nobody uses that. It's pretty rare. You certainly, at least as far as I can think, you wouldn't use that in reporting your scores to your athletic director. You'd basically say, bench press maxes went up an average of 5% or something like that. Or you'd say that the median improvement in bench press was 10 pounds or something to that effect, right? So that's typically how you'd report those out. Variability is, as you can see, the range of scores and how they are distributed about the mean or about the middle. So the range is the easiest measure of variability to conceptualize because it is just the two extremes. So let's say, average improvement was 10 pounds, but the range was, let's say, 60 pounds, right? But compared between the high and the low numbers. But because the range only uses the extremes, that may not be an accurate measure of variability. So a more common one is standard deviation, which is, as you can see, a measure of variability about the mean. So it is how closely are the scores distributed to the average. So a small standard deviation means that the scores are really closely clustered to the average, and then a large standard deviation means that there is more variability. Percentile rank, so you'll see this, you've probably seen it in your own test scores. You'll see it related to growth charts is another common place I've seen this. If somebody's in the 95th percentile, it means that everybody, that 95% of people scored lower than them, right? And so that's what percentile rank is. It is how close to the top are you. So hopefully you have a really high number. If you're in the 50th percentile, you're kind of right in the middle, right? So for example, if you look at a kid's growth chart and they are in the 50th percentile, they are basically just average height, and they've been tracking that way. So this is standard deviation. This is the old bell curve, and this is the standard distribution. So the mean, the average is right here in the middle. And so what this means is that almost 70% of the scores, 68% of test takers, finished within this range. So all pretty closely clustered to the average, and then you start to get closer to your outlier. So 13% scored higher than one standard deviation from the mean, 13% scored lower than one standard deviation from the mean. So I know most of you probably took the ACT, but the SAT, the way that the scores are set up, or at least used to be, I haven't had to mess with standardized test scores in a while, but the way that at least the scoring used to work with the SAT was that 1,000 was the average, right? And so if you got 1,100, what that meant was that you were more than one standard deviation from the mean. If you got 1,200, now you're 2 standard deviations from the mean. 1,300, keep on moving over. And then the same vice versa. So if you got 900, 1 standard deviation below, 800, 2 standard deviations below, on down. So it kind of gave you an idea of where you stood relative to your peers, right? So obviously the higher scores, closer to the 1600, the closer you get to that number, the better, because that was the perfect score, and I think probably still is. All right, inferential statistics. So if you can infer something, you can draw a conclusion based on that information. So with this, we can infer, so one of the things that's most commonly inferred is based on this population that I've tested. So for example, I did push-up testing for a class of 6th graders, and the average was, I don't know, 15. And so my inferential statistics, or one of the things that I would say is based on this class, I would assume that most 6th grade classes have an average maximum push-up score around 15. So that would be an inferential statistic. Now what that assumes is that the class that you picked is representative. So maybe the class that you picked never has PE, never really gets any physical activity. Maybe they're just a really sedentary group, and most other classes actually have a much higher average score because they get a little bit more physical activity. So one of the problems with inferential statistics is making sure that you actually have a representative sample if you're extrapolating to that larger group. As opposed to magnitude, and the one that I'm going to call your attention to here is effect size. If you've had Dr. Kephart, he loves effect size, and rightly so. So effect size is related to the proportion of change. So for example, you may see some statistic that by, let's go with exercising more, and I'm making this number up, but by exercising more, it cuts your risk of dying by 50%, right? But if we look at the effect size, your likelihood of dying is really, really low, like vanishingly low either way. And so if we cut it from 2% to 1%, then that's a 50% decrease proportionally. And so the effect size isn't really that big. That wasn't the best example. If you see something where there is a percent change in bench press scores, let's go with that. You know, somebody improved 10% in their bench press, but that was only 1 pound, right? As far as the effect size goes, like, do we really care about a 1 pound change? And that's where effect size matters, is it tells you, like, practically in a real number rather than a proportional number, does that matter? Because with really small numbers to start with, percentages can often throw you off. Like if they start, like I said, if they start with 1 and they move to 2, well, it's a 100% increase. But 2 is still a pretty small number, so the effect size may not be something worth your time. And then, so obviously you would use or could use all these numbers to develop an athletic profile. So what we're doing is we're using these test results to say, you know, here, and I mentioned this last time with chapter 12, here are your strengths, here are your weaknesses, here are your areas to work on. And you can also then develop a profile of your whole team. Overall, we have fairly low power production. We have low vertical jump scores, and so maybe that's because we've been doing too much high intensity, low speed training, and maybe we need to phase some of that out and do more lower intensity, high speed training, that kind of stuff. You can use normative data, so that is, you know, peer groups, basically. So if you're testing, you know, college football players, you could look at scores for other college football players. It's not exactly normative data, but it's the same concept. And then all this other stuff we've talked about. And so that is the end of chapter 13. Let's see how long that took. 23 minutes, not bad. So next time we'll move on to chapter 14, and that'll finish us out for the week. So we'll see you then.